This is Audible.
Spark, the revolutionary new science of exercise and the brain, by John J. Rady, M.D., with Eric Hagerman. Read by Walter Dixon. Breaking the bonds. While molecular scientists approach brain lock with tools to pick it, Emory University neurologist Helen Mayberg wants to smash it wide open. Several years ago, she tested a radical therapy called deep brain stimulation, DBS, in which she inserted an electrode into the subgenual cortex in a half-dozen severely depressed patients, for whom every other form of medical treatment had failed. These people are stuck, Mayberg says. They have an inability to put thought into action because they're not in gear. We need to find a way, metaphorically, to unstick them. She used voltage, and the results were profound. All 6 patients spontaneously described sensations such as a disappearance of the void, right there on the operating table, the second the electrodes were switched on. 4 of them eventually achieved full remission. The area of the brain Mayberg targeted is the tip of the anterior cingulate, which is the major way station between information coming down from prefrontal cortex and up from limbic system. A landing between upstairs and downstairs in your emotional stairwell. As the seat of executive function, it prioritizes what you pay attention to and indirectly regulates the limbic system, integrating cognitive and emotional signals. If it fails to shift attention from the negative, in the case of depression, you can't think about anything else. Not being able to initiate, not being able to think clearly, not being able to care about your family, those are secondary to something that your attention is directed to internally, but that is a false signal, Mayberg explains. You can fix it, and then other problems may be more accessible. The real goal of DBS is to bring the prefrontal cortex back online so you can use your executive function to tackle the core issues. It frees you up to attack the problem rationally. I'm not a bad person, my children love me, and my life is not beyond repair. This is also one of the effects of exercise. In 2003, a group of German neuroscientists did an experiment with 24 people with mild depression, who were being treated with drugs, and 10 healthy controls. They all took a battery of neuropsychological tests designed to gauge executive function. They repeated the tests after 30 minutes of stationary cycling at 40% of their maximum heart rate, then again at 60%, low enough to keep lactic acid out of the equation. The depressed patients showed significant improvement on 2 of the 4 tests at both intensity levels, which demonstrated that exercise immediately improves the highest form of thinking. Even 1 bout of exercise was enough to influence the prefrontal cortex. The 10 non-depressed volunteers didn't show much improvement, but then there was nothing to fix. Mayberg would be the first to say that executive function is still only part of the story. In comparing PET scans of patients who responded to antidepressants against others who responded to cognitive behavior therapy, she found that the 2 approaches change activity levels of the limbic system from opposite directions. Antidepressants seem to work through a bottom-up chain of events, meaning the activity begins in the brainstem and ripples through the limbic system until it reaches the prefrontal cortex. This might explain why antidepressants relieve the physical effects first. We feel more energetic before we feel less sad. With cognitive behavioral therapy and psychotherapy, we feel better about ourselves before we feel better physically. Therapy works from the prefrontal cortex down to modify our thinking so we can challenge the learned helplessness and spring ourselves out of the hopeless spiral. The beauty of exercise is that it attacks the problem from both directions at the same time. It gets us moving, naturally, which stimulates the brain stem and gives us more energy, passion, interest, and motivation. We feel more vigorous. From above, in the prefrontal cortex, exercise shifts our self-concept by adjusting all the chemicals I've mentioned, including serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, BDNF, VEGF, and so on. And, unlike many antidepressants, exercise doesn't selectively influence anything. It adjusts the chemistry of the entire brain to restore normal signaling. It frees up the prefrontal cortex so we can remember the good things and break out of the pessimistic patterns of depression. It also serves as proof that we can take the initiative to change something. This paradigm holds true for exercise's effect on mood in general, regardless of whether we're depressed or coping with some nagging symptoms, or even if we're just having a bad day. The idea of attacking depression from both directions couldn't be more important. Even with the brain stimulation patients, once you get the system back online, they need mental rehabilitation, Mayberg says. Part of the initial rehab is simply to get them doing something. The best kind of behavioral therapy is to just go outside, go for a walk, do something. It doesn't require you to have elaborate planning. It doesn't put you into a negative spin. If you do a physical activity, it's very quickly reinforcing because, before, you couldn't initiate to make yourself do something. If your prefrontal cortex has been offline for a while, you need to reprogram it, and exercise is the perfect tool. You begin to look at the world differently, and you see trees instead of a barren wasteland. When you see yourself moving, that alone is an achievement, proof that you can help yourself. Out of the tunnel. Science has come a long way since our search for the single culprit began, and the decades' worth of research generated from the monoamine hypothesis has taught us volumes about the biology of emotions. The closer we get to the cause of depression, the more complex it appears. When we began, everyone was fairly certain that the problem was an imbalance of neurotransmitters at the synapses. Now we know for certain that it's not so simple. Ironically, I think this is precisely why exercise has yet to be embraced as a medical treatment. It doesn't simply raise serotonin or dopamine or norepinephrine. It adjusts all of them to levels that, we can only presume, have been optimally programmed by evolution. The same goes for exercise's effect on BDNF, IGF-1, VEGF, and FGF2, which provide the building material and oversight for the construction of new connections in neurons. In short, exercise affects so many variables in the brain that it's nigh impossible to isolate its effect as we'd like, in the name of hard science. But the evidence is there, from the action of microscopic molecules to massive surveys of tens of thousands of people over the years. Yes, exercise is an antidepressant, but it is also much more. Still, it's not surprising that about half the patients in studies on exercise and depression drop out. Perhaps because most of them are inactive to begin with, getting started is that much more challenging. This is critical for doctors to keep in mind when recommending exercise. With people who are already feeling hopeless, it's important to keep expectations reasonable, so as not to reinforce the negative. On the other hand, studies have shown that even people who find the act of exercise inherently unpleasant have a positive mood swing the minute the workout is over. If you know what's on the other side, it's easier to push through the difficulty. Human beings are social animals, so if you're depressed, it would be ideal to choose a form of exercise that encourages making connections and that can take place outside or in some environment that stimulates the senses. Asking someone to join you in exercise and putting yourself in a new setting will give those newly hatched neurons a powerful reason for being. New connections need to be formed to represent the sensory stimulation. Breaking out of the emptiness that the brain has been locked into provides a sense of purpose and self-worth that evokes a positive future. Once you develop the positive feeling, you need to devote it to something. Then you get the bottom-up motivation and physical boost combined with the top-down reevaluation of yourself. By motivating the body to move, you're encouraging the mind to embrace life. The prescription. The first question people ask me when I suggest exercise as therapy is, how much should I do? There is no firm answer, especially given depression's wide spectrum of symptoms and severity. But Madhukar Trivedi has drawn some conclusions about the amount necessary to be effective. By quantifying exercise as a dose, he hopes to cast treatment in terms the medical profession might accept. This is all important, because doctors have to spend time with their patients to figure out what sort of regimen is likely to keep them moving. In one study, Trivedi and Andrea Dunn divided 80 depressed patients into 5 groups, 4 with exercise protocols of different intensities and frequencies, and 1 control group assigned to supervised stretching only, to see if social interaction with the supervisors had any effect. They used calories burned per pound of body weight as the dose measure. The high-intensity groups burned an average of 1,400 calories, 8 calories per pound, during the course of either 3 or 5 sessions per week. At the end of 3 months, regardless of frequency, the high-intensity groups cut their depression scores in half. Practically speaking, their symptoms dropped significantly. The low-intensity groups burned an average of 560 calories, 3 calories per pound, and lowered their scores by a third, about the same as the stretching group, and about as effective as a placebo. What this means for us is what I always tell people. Some exercise is good, more is better, to a point. Trivedi and Dunn based the high dose on public health recommendations for exercise, which suggest 30 minutes of moderate aerobic activity on most days. If you weigh 150 pounds, that would translate into about 3 hours at moderate intensity per week. The low dose would be equivalent to 80 minutes per week. Just multiply your body weight by 8 to figure out how much you should be burning for the high dose, and then head to the gym to find out how many calories you burn during a given workout. Most of the aerobic machines track this for you. If you weigh 150 pounds and burn 200 calories in 30 minutes on the elliptical trainer, you'd want to do 6 sessions a week to meet the high dose. I would recommend at least this much exercise for anyone who, like my patient Bill, has a shadow syndrome of depression. These are people who aren't clinically depressed, but who tend to look at life with a primarily pessimistic attitude, or who have the impression that nobody in the world, themselves included, meets their high standards. For Bill, when he got into running and lifting weights, he met up with a group of regulars at the gym every morning for a workout and coffee. His performance and relationships at work improved, and he felt like he didn't look at every new project with knee-jerk resentment. He almost welcomed new challenges, which completely changed his wife's view of him. Then, there are those people who are just moody. They tend to have low self-esteem, partly because they're so uncertain about how they'll feel from day to day, crabby or buoyant. One of my patients, Jillian, fit this description. We started exploring this issue after she got engaged to the man of her dreams and began feeling blue and irritable more often than not. Naturally, I had been pushing her to exercise, and she finally joined a gym near her office. Wisely, she teamed up with a coworker who was already going, and they supported each other to work out every day at lunchtime. After a few months, she was pleased with herself, and she expressed how stabilizing the daily activity was. It helped her maintain a rhythm in her life, which added to her sense of stability. Some people who have mood swings may describe themselves as manic-depressive or bipolar, but that's a problem of an entirely different magnitude. I haven't discussed bipolar disorder primarily because so little research has been done on exercise's effects on it. Recently, though, a preliminary study clearly showed that hospitalized patients with bipolar disorder who participated in a walking program suffered fewer depressive symptoms and less anxiety compared to those who were unwilling or unable to participate. And giving bipolar patients a stable social routine has been shown to improve long-term outcomes. It's only been very recently that exercise started making its way into treatment protocols for bipolar disorder. In some ways, exercise is even more important for prevention than it is for treatment. One of the first symptoms of depression, even before your mood drops to new lows, is sleep disturbance. Either you can't get up, or you can't get to sleep, or both. I think of it as sleep inertia, trouble starting or stopping. First, you lose your energy, then your interest in things. The key is to get moving immediately and do not stop. Set up a schedule for a daily walk, run, jog, bike ride, or dance class. If you can't sleep, go for a walk in the dawn light and do it every day. Take the dog out. Change your schedule. Run from the depression. Burn those 1,400 calories as if your life depended on it and nip it in the bud. If you have severe depression, you may feel like you're at the bottom of a pit, in a state of slow death, and that it's almost impossible to make it outside or go to the gym or even think about moving. First, see your doctor about medication and get yourself some omega-3 supplements, which are proven to have antidepressant effects. This will, I hope, loosen up the brain lock enough for you to at least go for a walk. Ask for help. Get a friend or family member to agree to come by every day, at the same time if possible, to escort you outside and around the block. In England and Australia, walking groups for patients with depression have been popular for years, and now they're starting to make their way to the United States. So check the internet to see if there is one in your area. If that's not an option, and you have the means, set up a regular time with a personal trainer. This might sound crazy, I realize, if you feel like you can't even lift yourself off the couch, but if that's the case, activity is all the more urgent. Exercise is not an instant cure, but you need to get your brain working again, and if you move your body, your brain won't have any choice. It's a process, and the best strategy is to take it one step and then one stride at a time. Start slowly and build on it. At its core, depression is defined by an absence of moving toward anything, and exercise is the way to divert those negative signals and trick the brain into coming out of hibernation. Chapter 6. Attention Deficit. Running from Distraction. I suspect the first time I realized I was not like my peers was at the early age of 3, when I discovered no one else in my family or neighborhood was forced to wear a child leash. Wrote Sam, a 36-year-old venture capitalist who came to me in hopes of understanding his lifelong disorder, which was starting to manifest itself in his young son. I have always been known in the family as the troublemaker, and spent most of my childhood in the doghouse and the dunce corner. My teachers felt that I had the ability to be a good student, but never fully applied myself. I am able to express myself well and organize my thoughts, but often procrastinate. Sam is no dunce, but like so many others with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, his erratic behavior led everyone around him to label him as stupid or stubborn or spoiled. He didn't want his son to suffer the same shame, and he was now seeking help at the encouragement of his business partner and his wife. "Neither quite understands how I can function with so much chaos in my life," he told me. Chaos, high drama, deadline pressure, acute stress of any form acts like a drug for Sam's brain. His letter to me outlining his history acknowledges that he had disciplinary problems because he didn't deal well with authority figures and that he got into drugs at age 14. Yet he wasn't exactly a delinquent. When he turned 16, his parents forbade him from getting his driver's license until he shaped up, and he boosted his GPA from 1.5 to 3.5 almost overnight. Proof, many would argue, that his teachers were right. He just needed to try. But the problem with Sam wasn't his attitude. ADHD stems from a malfunction of the brain's attention system, a diffuse linkage of neurons that hitches together areas controlling arousal, motivation, reward, executive function, and movement. Let's take one element of the attention system, motivation. While it's true that people with ADHD just need to get motivated, it's also true that, like every other aspect of our psychology, motivation is biological. What about the child who can't pay attention in class, but can sit perfectly still for hours playing a video game? Or the woman who spaces out when her husband is talking, but has no trouble focusing on magazine gossip about Brad and Angelina? Obviously, they can pay attention when they want to, right? Not exactly. If we were to look at functional MRI, fMRI, scans of the brains of these people and scientists have, we would see distinct differences in activity at the reward center in each situation. The reward center is a cluster of dopamine neurons called the nucleus accumbens, which is responsible for doling out pleasure or satisfaction signals to the prefrontal cortex, and thus providing the necessary drive or motivation to focus. The sort of stimulation that will activate the reward center enough to capture the brain's attention varies from person to person. What wound up working for Sam was the rigid structure and rigorous physical activity of college athletics, and the desire to prove to everyone back home that he wasn't stupid. He put himself through school by playing Division III football and lacrosse, and made the dean's list a number of times. I believe participating in a sporting regimen which required 5 a.m. practice sessions, he wrote, was the turning point that allowed me to see that I could function better in all my endeavors. Now he runs several miles every morning and is a partner in a venture capital firm, matching entrepreneurs with big money investors. In the parlance of this rarefied realm, Sam is what's known as a rainmaker, a high-energy personality with the social skills and business savvy to make deals happen. When there's a big one on the table, he has no trouble focusing. The intense pressure allows him to laser in and obsess over every angle, often to the point that the deal consumes all his waking hours. Paradoxically, the ability to hyper-focus is a common trait of ADHD, and it often leads people to miss the diagnosis because it doesn't seem to fit. New patients will tell me that they can't possibly have ADHD since they often get completely absorbed in what they're reading or doing. But the glitch in the attention system isn't strictly a deficit. It's more of an inability to direct attention or to focus on command. I tell my patients a more helpful way to think of ADHD is as an attention variability disorder. The deficit is one of consistency. Sam gets this. He schedules important work and meetings early in the day when he can still feel the calming effects of his morning run, knowing that he gets progressively more scattered as the day goes on. As for returning phone calls, if it weren't for his secretary, it would never happen. He still struggles with most of the core behavioral symptoms that branded him a problem child back in school, but he's figured out how to manage his ADHD and harness his hyperactivity to some extent, even using it to his advantage. By recognizing his difficulties, he's been able to arrange his day and his life in such a way that he can be successful. Mass distraction. I have co-authored 3 books about ADHD with my friend and colleague Ned Hallowell. The first, Driven to Distraction, was published in 1994, and as it grew into a bestseller and the broader public became familiar with the general outlines of ADHD, along came the biggest cultural paradigm shift of the century, the World Wide Web. The Internet's endless stream of distractions would challenge anyone's attention span. It's easy to get distracted in today's world. It's become so full of information, noise, and interruptions that all of us feel overwhelmed and unfocused at times. The amount of data in the world is doubling every few years, but our attention system, like the rest of the brain, was built to make sense of the surrounding environment as it existed 10,000 years ago. In our cyber-centric world, however, we quickly learn to expect things to happen immediately, and if they don't, we're easily frustrated. If our cell phone doesn't ring, or our email inbox sits empty for more than an hour, we wonder what's going on. Who has the time or patience to sequence or plan or think things through and evaluate consequences? Why bother when we can click to the next? It's no wonder exercise gets pushed to the bottom of the priority list. It requires planning and work. Experts estimate that just over 4% of American adults, that's 13 million people, have ADHD, which is not to say that the remaining 96% of the population is completely free of attention problems. To a certain degree, everyone suffers from fleeting attention. And, as I've mentioned, there are varying degrees of severity for many mental health disorders. Shadow syndromes, which are personality traits that don't necessarily meet the full checklist of symptoms doctors rely on to make diagnoses. People with shadows of ADHD might have constant problems with romantic relationships, for example. Or they might succeed in intense, high-energy fields, or both. They often become entrepreneurs, bond traders, salespeople, emergency room doctors, firefighters, trial lawyers, movie moguls, or advertising executives. These are jobs in which the tendency toward hyperactivity, nonlinear thinking, and risk-taking can lead to great achievements. Sporadic attention can be a real strength in a frenetic setting. People with shadows of ADHD might retain problems with organization, forgetfulness, and personal relationships, but they can get it together when the pressure is on. There are still those who think the way Sam's teacher did. Because all of us suffer from lapses in attention, it's easy to assume that all it takes to concentrate is a little effort. I still meet people who believe ADHD is just a matter of laziness or bad child rearing or stupidity or willfulness or hooliganism. Ironically, such skepticism has roots in the medical community itself, which for decades believed that kids magically grew out of ADHD in adolescence. Some of the work I'm most proud of is challenging this conventional wisdom and showing that ADHD exists in adults. Now, ADHD is the most studied disorder in medicine, and it's clearly not an attitude problem. Otherwise, it wouldn't run in families. But according to a study of nearly 2,000 Australian identical twins, if one twin has ADHD, there is a 91% chance the other one will have it too. The landmark study proving that ADHD stems from a biological irregularity was published by Alan Zemetkin and his colleagues from the National Institute of Mental Health in 1990. Using PET scans to measure brain activity, the study showed that during an attention test, the brains of adults with ADHD work differently from those without ADHD. Zemetkin and his colleagues found that the group with ADHD showed 10% less brain activity than the control group, and the largest deficit was within the prefrontal cortex, which has a firm hand in regulating behavior. It's also prone to positive reinforcement through exercise. Signs of trouble. The phrase attention deficit disorder didn't even exist until it was introduced in the third edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual in 1980. Since then, we've debated whether to establish separate diagnoses for the two primary categories of symptoms, inattention and hyperactivity. Inattention is always part of the disorder, and sometimes hyperactivity is present as well. Hyperactivity is more common in children than adults, and especially, though not exclusively, boys. And for years, kids with the rambunctious brand of ADHD were the only cases diagnosed. Nobody connected the behavior of hyperactive kids with that of the daydreamers, but the treatment is the same in either case, and now we call the disorder ADHD, regardless of whether hyperactivity is part of the picture. The hyperactive kids are the ones you can't miss. They're the Dennis the Menace characters, bouncing off the walls or fidgeting in their seats, constantly moving, picking at themselves, shaking their legs, doodling, fiddling. Because of their impatience, they intrude and interrupt, blurting things out without thinking. They feel as though they're always racing, and they finish our sentences because they assume they know what we're going to say, or they're bored by it. In general, they have a hard time staying on task. They can't stand playing by themselves, and often adopt the role of class clown if they're having trouble with school. Many of them are socially adept, although they can also act awkwardly because they miss social cues. And, like Sam, they begin to hear early on that they're screw-ups. But with many of these kids, it's plain as day that they need to be moving, and they end up playing sports and doing well. Impulsivity fits in here as a subset of hyperactivity. Children and adults can automatically overreact, negatively or positively, which makes them passionate and quick to anger. Road rage is essentially a temper tantrum, and a red flag for particularly hyperactive forms of ADHD. Just making it through traffic to my office is a trial for some of my patients. "I wish I had howitzers in my headlights," one woman told me. "I'd blast everyone out of the way." Impatience feeds this response too. People with ADHD will do anything not to stand in line, and can explode if they're made to wait. Inattention or distractibility is the constant among ADHD symptoms. One couple came in to see me because the wife's inability to pay attention was undermining the relationship. Although she was a whiz at running an intensive care unit, she thrived on the action. She couldn't pay attention to her own family. Even as the husband related this in my office, he suddenly said, "Look!" And sure enough, she was staring out the window. ADHD people go off topic and forget ideas and goals and things. One of the classic signs is the pirouette. Stepping out the door, the ADHD patient will spin around and go back upstairs to get something she forgot. Everyone does this, of course, but for some of my patients it's a daily occurrence. The one day the ADHD student does do his homework, he leaves it at home. The ADHD brain faces a monumental challenge in initiating a task, and it is a master procrastinator. Its owner will sit down to do something she really wants to do, and then clean her desk instead. The attention deficit patient often can't complete something until the sword of Damocles is over her head. She has a terrible time organizing things, so her room and office are messy, and she has a love-hate relationship with structure. My patient Sam wasn't rebelling against authority per se. He was acting out of frustration from his inability to navigate structure. Paradoxically, one of the best treatment strategies for ADHD involves establishing extremely rigid structure. Over the years, I've heard countless parents offer the same observation about their ADHD children. Johnny is so much better when he's doing Taekwondo. He wasn't doing his homework, and he was angry, difficult, and problematic. Now, his best qualities have come out. You could substitute any of the martial arts here, or any highly structured form of exercise, such as ballet, figure skating, or gymnastics. Less traditional sports, such as rock climbing, mountain biking, whitewater paddling, and, sorry to tell you, Mom, skateboarding, are also effective, in the sense that they require complex movements in the midst of heavy exertion. The combination of challenging the brain and the body has a greater positive impact than aerobic exercise alone. One small study from a graduate student at Hofstra University tested this fact. He found that ADHD boys age 8 to 11 participating in martial arts twice a week improved their behavior and performance on a number of measures compared to those on a typical aerobic exercise program. Both kinds of exercise led to dramatic improvement over non-active controls. The kids involved in martial arts finished more of their homework, were better prepared for class, improved their grades, broke fewer rules, and jumped out of their seats less often. In short, they were better able to stay on task. The technical movements inherent in any of these sports activate a vast array of brain areas that control balance, timing, sequencing, evaluating consequences, switching, error correction, fine motor adjustments, inhibition, and, of course, intense focus and concentration. In the extreme, playing these kinds of sports is a matter of survival, avoiding getting karate chopped or breaking your neck on the balance beam or drowning in a swirling pool of whitewater, and thus taps into the focusing power of the fight-or-flight response. When the mind is on high alert, there is plenty of motivation to learn the skills necessary for these activities. As far as the brain is concerned, it's do or die. And, of course, most of the time we will be in the aerobic range, which boosts our cognitive abilities and makes it easier to absorb new moves and strategies. Coming through, loud and unclear. The attention system doesn't claim a central address in the brain. Rather, it's a diffuse web of reciprocal pathways that begins at the locus ceruleus, the arousal center, a part of the brainstem, and sends signals throughout the brain to wake it up and cue our attention. The network engages such areas as the reward center, the limbic system, and the cortex. More recently, scientists have included the cerebellum, which governs balance and fluidity. It turns out that there's a lot of overlap between attention, consciousness, and movement. The attention circuits are jointly regulated by the neurotransmitters norepinephrine and dopamine, which are so similar on a molecular level that they can plug into each other's receptors. These are the chemicals targeted by ADHD medications, and, of the many genes correlated with the disorder, scientists focus on the ones that regulate these two neurotransmitters. Broadly speaking, the problem for people with ADHD is that their attention system is patchy. They describe it as discontinuous, fragmented, and uncoordinated, problems that can stem from a dysfunction with either of these neurotransmitters or in any one of the brain areas in the system, which helps explain how one disorder can have so many different faces. For instance, the locus coeruleus serves as the on-off switch for sleep, and thus is closely tied to circadian rhythms. One of the common symptoms in people with ADHD is abnormal sleep patterns. They often have problems going to sleep or staying asleep, and they suffer sleep disturbances such as sleepwalking or sleep-talking and nightmares. Early theories about hyperactivity proposed that arousal was the chief problem, that children, bouncing off the walls, were essentially trying to keep themselves alert. But the locus coeruleus, which busily produces norepinephrine in the depths of the brainstem, is merely the first opportunity for error. Norepinephrine-carrying axons extending from there, along with dopamine-equipped axons from the ventral tegmental area, VTA, plug into neurons in the amygdala. As I mentioned in Chapter 3, the amygdala is responsible for assigning emotional intensity to incoming stimuli before we're conscious of it, and then sends it along for higher processing. In the context of ADHD, the amygdala determines the noticeableness of things. An unregulated amygdala is what feeds the tantrums or blind aggression in patients with ADHD, and their oversensitivity to excitement can lead to panic attacks. Sometimes, excitability is a positive. People with ADHD can get so enthusiastic about something that they energize a room full of people. Holding the attention of others is no problem for those with ADHD. Dopamine also carries signals to the nucleus accumbens, or reward center, which is where Ritalin, amphetamine dexoamphetamine, Adderall, and the active ingredients of other stimulants, from coffee to chocolate to cocaine, end up. The reward center needs to be sufficiently activated before it will carry out its important duty of telling the prefrontal cortex that something is worth paying attention to. It engages the prioritizing aspect of executive function, and this is a central component of motivation. Essentially, the brain won't do much unless the reward center is responsive. Laboratory studies have shown that monkeys with lesions in the nucleus accumbens cannot sustain attention, and thus can't muster the motivation to perform tasks that don't carry immediate rewards. The same is true of people with ADHD, who favor immediate gratification over more mundane tasks that will help them down the road, like studying for a test that will help them get into college. I call them prisoners of the present. They can't maintain focus on a long-term goal, and so it seems as though they lack drive. The prefrontal cortex bears responsibility for ADHD too. We can think of inattention in general as an inability to inhibit interest in unimportant stimuli and motor impulses. In other words, we can't stop paying attention to what we shouldn't be paying attention to. The prefrontal cortex is also the home of working memory, which sustains attention during the delay for a reward, and holds multiple issues in the mind at once. If working memory is impaired, we can't stay on task or work toward a long-term goal because we can't keep an idea in mind long enough to operate on it, or to ponder, process, sequence, plan, rehearse, and evaluate consequences. Working memory, which is like our random access memory, RAM, can be considered the backbone of all the executive functions. A failure of working memory is also why people with ADHD are terrible at keeping track of time and thus prone to procrastination. They literally forget to worry about the passing time. So, they never get started on the task at hand. An ADHD sufferer who is on the verge of losing her job because she's always late to work might go for the cereal box in the morning, decide the cupboard needs to be rearranged, and forget that she has to be out the door at a certain time. Then, when she remembers, panic sets in. Attention all control units. It's not simply a matter of whether the signals get through to capture our attention, but how fluidly that information travels. This is where the attention system ties in with movement, and thus exercise. The areas of the brain that control physical movement also coordinate the flow of information. The cerebellum is a primitive part of the brain that for decades was assumed to be involved only with governing and refining movement. When we learn how to do something physical, whether it's a karate kick or snapping our fingers, the cerebellum is hard at work. The cerebellum takes up just 10% of the brain's volume, but it contains half of our neurons, which means it's a densely packed area constantly buzzing with activity. But it keeps rhythm for more than just motor movements. It regulates certain brain systems so they run smoothly, updating and managing the flow of information to keep it moving seamlessly. In patients with ADHD, parts of the cerebellum are smaller in volume and don't function properly, so it makes sense that this could cause disjointed attention. The cerebellum sends information to the prefrontal and motor cortices, the centers for thinking and movement. But along the route is an important cluster of nerve cells called the basal ganglia, which acts as a sort of automatic transmission, subconsciously shifting attentional resources as the cortex demands. It's modulated by dopamine signals stemming from the substantia nigra. Dopamine works like transmission fluid. If there's not enough, as is the case in people with ADHD, attention can't easily be shifted, or can only be shifted all the way into high gear. A lot of what scientists know about the basal ganglia comes from research into Parkinson's disease, which is caused by a depletion of dopamine in this area. The disease wreaks havoc with the patient's ability to coordinate not only motor movements, but also complex cognitive tasks. In the early stages of Parkinson's, these malfunctions show up as adult-onset ADHD. The parallel is important because, based on a number of strong studies, neurologists are now recommending daily exercise in the early stages of Parkinson's disease to stave off symptoms. Scientists induced Parkinson's in rats by killing the dopamine cells in their basal ganglia and then forced half of them to run on a treadmill twice a day in the 10 days following the onset of the disease. Incredibly, the runners' dopamine levels stayed within normal ranges, and their motor skills didn't deteriorate. In one study on people with Parkinson's, intensive activity improved motor ability as well as mood, and the positive effects lasted for at least 6 weeks after they stopped exercising. What I find so compelling is the strong relationship between movement and attention. They share overlapping pathways, which is probably why activities like martial arts work well for ADHD kids. They have to pay attention while learning new movements, which engages and trains both systems. A controversial treatment for dyslexia, which occurs in about 30% of ADHD patients, relies entirely on physical movements to train the cerebellum. Dyslexia, dyspraxia, and attention treatment, DDAT, is based on the theory that a disruption in the brain's ability to coordinate movement might be responsible for eye-tracking problems and thus difficulties in learning to read and write. Researchers also know that most children with dyslexia perform worse than average on tests of cerebellar function. DDAT involves practicing a collection of fairly simple motor skills drills twice a day for 10 minutes. In 2003, British researchers tested the effectiveness of DDAT on 35 children with dyslexia and declared the results astounding. Compared to no treatment, the students who followed the DDAT regimen for 6 months showed a significant improvement in reading and writing fluency, eye movement, cognitive skills, and physical measures such as dexterity and balance. My friend and colleague Ned Hallowell uses this method, among many others, at his ADHD treatment center, and has seen the positive effects in his own son. And prominent scientists at Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons are just embarking on a large study assessing the usefulness of the DDAT method as a treatment for ADHD. Pharmacological studies have shown that ADHD drugs help normalize the activity of the cerebellum, as well as the corpus stratum. So it's clear these areas are important to attention, as well as movement. Perhaps by training our brain's movement centers to improve its higher functions, we can bring about a day when we're not as dependent on medication. Early clues. I have never gotten my taxes in before October. Every year begins the same way, with me resolving to beat the taxman's deadline. In early January, I neatly gather all my documents from my accountant. Then, inevitably, I'll find that a monthly statement has gone missing. I need to call my credit card company for a copy, which seems simple enough, but it kills my enthusiasm. The detail of tracking down the missing document or buying those little white tabs for labeling files will gnaw at the back of my mind for months. But the momentum is gone, and along with it, my motivation. As a child, thankfully, I had strict nuns for taskmasters, and when I wasn't at school, I was outside running full tilt in one sport or another. Still, my room was a disaster. I forgot things constantly, and my tennis coach claimed that I was the most consistently inconsistent player he'd ever seen. I have ADHD, obviously, but I never knew it. The term didn't exist when I was a kid. To the extent that anyone bothered with attention deficit, it was called hyperactivity. As a doctor, I didn't come across the disorder until I was teaching at Massachusetts Mental Health Center in the early 1980s. My residents presented a 22-year-old patient who had been in and out of the hospital for bouts of violent behavior. He mentioned that he had been on Ritalin as a hyperactive teenager, but had long since been taken off the medicine. It was believed that kids simply grew out of their hyperactivity after adolescence, and that it was dangerous to keep them on stimulants into adulthood for fear they'd become addicted. I suggested we try the Ritalin again, and it really toned down his violent outbursts. He was so relieved. He said he'd forgotten that he could feel calm and focused. Around the same time, I was immersed in studying severe aggression, researching, treating, and writing about what made patients of all sorts so violent. I stumbled across a study by Frank Elliott, then chairman of the neurology department at the University of Pennsylvania. Within a large population of prisoners, he discovered that more than 80% of them had had serious learning problems as children. I started to dig into the school histories of my aggression patients, and common stories emerged. It was clear that they shared a lifelong difficulty inhibiting their thoughts, behavior, and actions. Many of them hated authority, had low self-esteem born of chronic failure, and were driven by impulse. They acquainted themselves with trouble early in life and never managed to tap into the positive aspects of their personalities. A lot of them had gotten addicted to drugs as teenagers. These tendencies could easily combine with a hair-trigger response to frustration and set off violent episodes. It started to click that such destructive behavior might be rooted in the attention system. I began looking at my outpatients through the lens of attention. What I saw was that some people with chronic problems, such as depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and anger, also seemed to share an underlying condition of the attention system, which was easy to miss when it wasn't wrapped in hyperactivity. I began treating them with ADHD medicine, and I saw great improvement. As I discussed my ideas with colleagues, it became clear that there were milder forms of attention deficit that didn't necessarily land someone in prison or the hospital or the unemployment line. Once we looked past the stigma, my friend Ned and I recognized the symptoms in ourselves. The first paper I wrote on adult ADHD was soundly rejected, based on the criticism that I must be misdiagnosing some form of underlying depression or anxiety, or that I was trying to introduce a new disorder. But I knew we were onto something in 1989 when Ned and I gave our first lecture on the subject at a small conference in Cambridge, Massachusetts, for an organization founded by parents of kids with ADHD. The title of our talk was simply Adults with ADD. We didn't call it ADHD back then. After our presentation to a room full of 200 people, we figured we'd stick around for 15 minutes or so fielding questions. We were there for 4 hours. Clustered around the microphone in the aisle, one person after another told bits of their personal stories and asked what they meant. Many of them had the same disorder as their children, and they knew it. So did a fellow psychiatry professor who came in for treatment after overhearing me at a party one night discuss a case study. "I think you described me," he said, and launched into a highly intellectual rendition of his own history. Charles, I'll call him, was the classic absent-minded professor, wearing glasses and unkempt tweed, and he knew a lot more about psychiatry than I did at that point. I'd read several of his books. The twist to Charles's story is that he had been a marathon runner who had blown out his knee and become depressed when he was forced to set aside his passion. That's also when he noticed the symptoms of what we would agree was ADHD. He explained that he would have a tantrum if his girlfriend interrupted his writing, or yank the phone out of the wall if it rang while he was trying to concentrate. He was slipping out of touch with his friends. He fit the profile, and we decided to put him on ADHD medication, which helped. He was already on antidepressants when he first came to see me, but once he finished physical therapy and started training again, he dropped them because he felt so much better. As he closed in on his old fitness level, he became convinced that the ADHD medication was holding back his performance. Charles knew his mile times down to the second, and he was 10 seconds slower than he used to be. He decided to try a few days without the ADHD medication, and he found that as long as he was training, he could focus. Looking back on it, we recognized that his attention hadn't hampered him before because he'd always been a serious runner. Without a steady diet of exercise during his injury, he'd been unable to control his attention the way he needed to. Clearly, exercise had a powerful effect, and that was big news to me. Focus on exercise. Around the time Charles came in, I began to see a number of other intelligent, high-functioning professionals who had ADHD and were able to compensate for it. They didn't fit the stereotype in the literature. Nobody had ever talked about successful adults with attention disorders until Ned and I included their case studies in Driven to Distraction. Several of these patients had discovered on their own that they could use exercise as a way of self-medicating to allow them to be more productive. I remember one in particular who is now managing a billion-dollar hedge fund. He takes a stimulant in the morning and plays squash every day at lunch, right about the time the medicine wears off. Most people instinctively know that exercise burns off energy, and any teacher who has ever dealt with a hyperactive child will tell you that kids are much calmer after recess. Being calmer and more focused is one of the happy consequences of the 0-hour program in Naperville that I discussed in Chapter 1. School is an excruciating environment for a child with ADHD, given the need to sit still, face forward, and listen intently to a teacher for the better part of an hour. It's impossible for some, and it's the reason for a lot of disruptive behavior among school children. I got a dramatic reminder of this about 10 years ago on a trip to the San Carlos Apache Indian Reservation in Arizona. As part of the tribe's effort to tackle its community's health issues, I was invited to talk about ADHD to doctors, medical staff, parents, and teachers. ADHD is a huge but largely undiagnosed issue for the reservation kids because the incidence of the disorder among Apaches seems to be much higher than for the general population. As I outlined the symptoms and treatments to a group of middle school teachers one afternoon, several of them remarked that all of their kids had trouble sitting still. I asked about recess and was told that the kids have 3 a day. "If it rains and they can't go outside," one teacher piped up, "we bus the kids home. Otherwise, we can't handle them." Incredibly, there are few studies that provide good statistics on the prevalence of ADHD. One of the best comes from the Mayo Clinic. Researchers tracked all of the children born in Rochester, Minnesota, between 1976 and 1982, and followed up with those who stayed in the community until they were 5 years old. In all, this included 5,718 kids. The study reported that at age 19, at least 7.4% had ADHD, and suggested that the prevalence might be as high as 16%. Other studies suggest that approximately 40% of children with ADHD do grow out of it, and when it does persist into adulthood, symptoms of hyperactivity often subside. It's no coincidence that the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for inhibiting impulses, doesn't develop fully until we're in our early 20s. This is the biology of maturity. Engage the brain. Given the leading role of dopamine and norepinephrine in regulating the attention system, the broad scientific explanation for how exercise tempers ADHD is by increasing these neurotransmitters. And it does so immediately. With regular exercise, we can raise the baseline levels of dopamine and norepinephrine by spurring the growth of new receptors in certain brain areas. In the brain stem, balancing norepinephrine in the arousal center also helps. Chronic exercise improves the tone of the locus coeruleus, says Amelia Russo-Neustadt, a neuroscientist and psychiatrist at California State University. The result is that we're less prone to startle or to react out of proportion to any given situation, and we feel less irritable. Similarly, I think of exercise as administrating the transmission fluid for the basal ganglia, which, again, is responsible for the smooth shifting of the attention system. This area is a key binding site for Ritalin, and brain scans show it to be abnormal in children with ADHD. Exercise increases dopamine levels in the rat equivalent of this area by creating new dopamine receptors. One group of researchers, including the University of Georgia's Rodney Dishman, examined the effects of exercise in ADHD kids by using motor function tests that provide indirect measures of dopamine activity. The results threw Dishman for a loop, because boys and girls responded differently. In boys, rigorous exercise improved their ability to stare straight ahead and stick out their tongue, for example, indicating better motor reflex inhibition, which is the missing ingredient in hyperactivity. Girls didn't show this improvement, which may be because of the lower incidence of hyperactivity in girls. Boys and girls both improved by another measure related to the sensitivity of dopamine synapses, although boys fared better after maximal exercise and girls after submaximal exercise, 65 to 75% of maximum heart rate, respectively. An overactive cerebellum also contributes to fidgetiness in ADHD kids, and recent studies have shown that ADHD drugs that elevate dopamine and norepinephrine bring this area back in balance. Exercise also increases norepinephrine, and the more complex the exercise, the better. Rats don't do judo, but scientists have looked at the neurochemical changes in their brains after periods of acrobatic exercise, the closest parallel to martial arts. Compared to rats running on a treadmill, their cohorts who practiced complex motor skills improved levels of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, more dramatically, which suggests that growth is happening in the cerebellum. In the limbic system, as I've explained, exercise helps regulate the amygdala, which, in the context of ADHD, blunts the hair-trigger responsiveness a lot of patients experience. It evens out the reaction to a new stimulus, so we don't go overboard and scream at another driver in a fit of road rage, for example. To the extent that ADHD is a lack of control, of impulses and attention, the performance of the prefrontal cortex is critical. The seminal 2006 study from Arthur Kramer of the University of Illinois used MRI scans to show that walking as few as 3 days a week for 6 months increased the volume of the prefrontal cortex in older adults. And, when he tested aspects of their executive function, they showed improvement in working memory, smoothly switching between tasks and screening out irrelevant stimuli. Kramer wasn't on the trail of ADHD, but his findings illustrate another way exercise might help. Everyone agrees that exercise boosts levels of dopamine and norepinephrine, and one of the intracellular effects of these neurotransmitters, according to Yale University neurobiologist Amy Arnston, is an improvement in the prefrontal cortex's signal-to-noise ratio. She has found that norepinephrine boosts the signal quality of synaptic transmission, while dopamine decreases the noise, or static of undirected neuron chatter, by preventing the receiving cell from processing irrelevant signals. Arnsten also suggests that levels of the attention neurotransmitters follow an upside-down U pattern, meaning that increasing them helps to a point, after which there's a negative effect. As with every other part of the brain, the neurological soup needs to be at optimum levels. Exercise is the best recipe. A classic case. If you were to run into Jackson, my former patient, you would meet a compact 21-year-old in jeans and an untucked shirt who speaks articulately about his plans for the future. A typical American college kid, if not a little smarter. What stands out about him isn't so much where he is today, but how far he has come to get here, and how he did it. Jackson runs nearly every day, 3 miles on days that he also lifts weights, 6 miles on the others. If I don't do it, it's not like I feel guilty, he says. It's that I feel like I've missed something in my day, and I want to go do it, because I've figured out that while I'm exercising, I don't have trouble concentrating on anything. Jackson was 15 when he first came to see me, for anxiety exacerbated by his ADHD. His tendency to procrastinate invariably put him in impossible situations, and though he prided himself on the craftiness with which he manipulated teachers and academic deadlines, the constant conning took a toll on his nerves. By the end of high school, he had dug himself into a hole so deep that even he wasn't sure he could hustle his way out of it. His future came down to one question on one math test that he postponed until just before graduation. I dragged it out for so many days that I didn't actually know if I was going to graduate, he recalls. I was out there in a cap and a gown and didn't know if they were going to say my name. He pauses and then adds, I felt dumb. Jackson was diagnosed with ADHD early on, after his third-grade teacher picked up on his disruptive behavior and inability to complete classwork. He began taking Ritalin and stayed on some form of stimulant throughout his school years. He was smart, but he had a lot of trouble with school. As a day student at a top-ranked private academy, he simply had more work than he could get through. Sleep became rare, and when it did come, he would often wake up with a stomachache, dreading the drive to school. After having a panic attack, he withdrew from the school, despite a B average earned primarily by acing tests, and transferred to a public high school. Unlike some ADHD kids, Jackson was very social, founding after-school clubs and serving as a peer counselor for troubled kids. He figured he had a pretty good handle on psychology after everything he'd learned through his own troubles. All the extracurricular activities served as a foil for what was turning into severe anxiety and depression. And at one point, I had him taking Adderall, paroxetine, Paxil, and clonazepam, Klonopin, a long-acting anxiety drug. Academically, the material was easy enough, but the homework was such a source of stress that either he didn't do it or he rushed through it between classes. He had convinced himself that he was smart enough to pull off high school without really doing the work. He says he felt like a secret agent man, sneaking around, subverting the attendance rules, and dodging teachers to finish assignments and then feigning innocence. I thought I was so cool, he says. My crowning achievement was in this history class that I actually really liked. I didn't do this huge paper, but I managed somehow to trick the teacher into thinking I had, and that I got an A on it. I never handed it in. They did call Jackson's name at graduation. He squeaked through with a 1.8 GPA, far too low to go to the college he hoped to attend, despite family connections. A small junior college accepted him, though, and that was just fine. The triumph of completing school, along with the comfort of having a destination the next fall, put him on top of the world. In fact, he felt so good that summer that he decided to go off his medication. All of it. Needless to say, I was not in the loop at the time. It was the first time since grade school that he'd gone unmedicated for more than a day or two. I noticed that a lot of the small things that bothered me went away, he reports, and some not-so-small things. For the first time in his life, he was able to stick to normal sleep patterns, and his anxiety subsided. He figured he was simply feeling great because he had made it through school, but then, when he took some ADHD medicine to sit for an English placement exam for college, the irritating side effects returned. After the test, he shelved the meds. The turning point, however, happened in Spain that summer on a trip with his girlfriend. Walking around shirtless on the beach with all the Spanish dudes, he was inspired to do something about his Buddha belly. "I just started to run," he says, "and I started feeling great. Part of that, I'm sure, is that I was on vacation in Spain. Everything was great in my life, and I was going to this college that wasn't that hard, so I'm like, maybe I can just do this. I went to college that fall, and I never struggled for a second." Jackson's story appeals to me partly because he got into exercise for his body image, but stuck with it for the therapeutic effect. At first, all the running didn't make a dent in his physique, thanks to pizza and beer, but he stuck with it because it helped him focus. In his first semester at the junior college, he earned a 3.9 GPA, and after a year he was accepted as a transfer student at the college he had originally wanted to attend. It's a small, competitive New England institution where he earned a 3.5 GPA as a sophomore. His major? Psychology. He's clearly tuned into his own state of mind. If he falls off his exercise regimen, his concentration wavers. "I can definitely tell when I don't do it," he says. "It got to the point during midterms that I had no time, but I'm like, you know what? I have to go out and run and clear my head. I have to do this." He knows how it makes him feel, and that knowledge itself keeps him going. "I always have a million voices in my head all the time," he explains. "When I started exercising, it wasn't that I was just thinking about one thing, because I also have a problem hyperfocusing, but it was like I could concentrate on things that were important to me. Then I started thinking about it, and in general now I really don't have trouble concentrating. And because I'm off the meds, I don't have nearly as many sleep problems. There's never been any question in my mind that exercise is related, because it's this huge life change that I made. It's just so clear." Take the initiative. Not everyone with ADHD will experience the sweeping effect of exercise that Jackson did, and I would never have suggested he abruptly quit taking his medication, especially the antidepressant. His experience begs the question of whether exercise can replace Ritalin or Adderall or bupropion, Wellbutrin. And for the vast majority of cases, I would say the answer is no, at least not in the way James Blumenthal and his colleagues at Duke showed that exercise can stand in for Zoloft in treating depression. Yet, there is something instructive in Jackson's motivation for discontinuing his medication. I think he felt out of control, knowing that he was smart enough to succeed, but unable to make it happen. Constant frustration can lead to feelings of demoralization, and in Jackson's case, this fed his depression and anxiety. For him, taking medication exacerbated that feeling, creating a sense of dependency. Conversely, getting into a running routine provided a sense of control over his inner self, his mood, his anxiety, his focus. For the first time in his life, he felt like he could steer his own future. He used running as his medicine. For most of my patients, I suggest exercise as a tool to help them manage their symptoms along with their medication. The best strategy is to exercise in the morning and then take the medication about an hour later, which is generally when the immediate focusing effects of exercise begin to wear off. For a number of patients, I find that if they exercise daily, they need a lower dose of stimulant. I'm talking about taking the lead in your own treatment. The more you know about how ADHD works, and the more you recognize your foibles, the better you can prepare for them. I tell my patients they need to develop militant vigilance in terms of scheduling and structure. If you set up your environment in a certain way, you can corral your attention through your own actions and become more productive. Arrange your day and your surroundings in a way that encourages focus and accomplishment, moving the ball forward rather than letting it ricochet off the walls. I'm not suggesting that getting organized and establishing structure can melt away symptoms, but it can funnel your attention in the right direction. Today, many people are using ADHD coaches to help them do this. The external accountability is a powerful way to help you maintain routines, such as exercise, and to meet your goals. Jackson establishes structure for himself with his daily runs, and this works on 2 levels. The regular schedule shapes his time, so he doesn't have to think about it, and the exercise itself focuses the brain in all the ways I've mentioned. It's true that many ADHD kids are more active than their peers. Studies show they have less body fat on average, and I see plenty of adults with ADHD who are already exercising. But they need to be doing more, and on a regular basis. In general, I tell my patients to make every effort to institute a regimen of daily exercise, or at least during the 5 weekdays when they need to focus at school or work. Dishman's study suggests that submaximal exercise, which would be 65 to 75% of maximum heart rate, is more effective with girls, while more vigorous exercise, just below the anaerobic threshold, which I'll explain in Chapter 10, works better for boys. We don't really have parallel data for adults, but from what I've seen, it's important to get the heart rate up there, maybe 75% of your maximum for 20 or 30 minutes. For ADHD in particular, the complex, focus-intensive sports such as martial arts and gymnastics are a great way to tax the brain. By engaging every element of the attention system, it holds you rapt. These sports are just more interesting than running on a treadmill, and participation tends to be self-perpetuating. It's easier to stick with it. I try to do my workout first thing in the morning, both for the structure it affords and to set the right tone for the day. A lot of times, that keeps me going. And once I get into the intensity of therapy sessions, it's easy for me to hyper-focus on each patient. Researchers haven't quantified how long the spike in dopamine and norepinephrine lasts after exercise, but anecdotal evidence suggests an hour or maybe 90 minutes of calm and clarity. I tell people who need medication to take it at the point when the effects of exercise are wearing off, to get the most benefit from both approaches. The truth is, everyone has a different level of attention deficit, and you'll have to experiment to see which regimen works. My hope is that knowing how it works will allow you to find the best solution for you. If you want a minimum, I would say 30 minutes of aerobic exercise. It's not a lot of time, especially considering that it will help you focus enough to make the most of the rest of your day. Chapter 7. Addiction. Reclaiming the Biology of Self-Control. Among the 35,000 people who ran the New York City Marathon in November of 2006 were 16 former drug addicts, a number of whom joked openly that they'd spent most of their lives running from the cops. When they crossed the finish line, the distance they had come was far greater than 26.2 miles. Many of them had been imprisoned, homeless, or otherwise destitute when they checked themselves into Odyssey House, a rehabilitation program in New York that treats about 800 residents at half a dozen locations throughout the city. These are the rare, worst-case examples of what can happen to people who completely lose control of their behavior. And while the lives of those addicted to hard drugs such as crack or heroin or crystal meth look drastically different than the lives of those who use or abuse drugs without being hooked, the same principles apply to their brains, which is to say that the lessons of Odyssey House apply to anyone who struggles with self-control, including those who think of themselves as having addictive personalities. Scientists are now characterizing behavior such as gambling, compulsive shopping, and even overeating in the same biological terms they use to explain substance abuse. The common denominator is an out-of-control reward system, which some people are born with and some people develop. Odyssey House has been around since the late 1960s, offering services from counseling to job training, elder care to family reconciliation. In the spring of 2000, an employee named John Tavolachi started taking residents running in Central Park, with the goal of training for a 5K charity run held each fall. We run in groups with them and talk about what goes into running, the discipline, the structure, the teamwork, says Tavolachi, who is now Odyssey House's chief operating officer. Addicts usually isolate themselves, but here they motivate one another, and they see what it means to set goals and accomplish them. Many of his charges start out walking, and their first challenge is to follow the one rule Tabellacci imposes: no smoking. Then they build up to running the 1.58 miles around the Central Park Reservoir. About 100 or so residents participate in the exercise program, which is called Run for Your Life, and those who become serious runners stay in treatment about twice as long as the non-active residents. It sounds obvious, Tabellacci says, but the only thing that we know about treatment is the longer a person stays in, the more likely they are to succeed. Odyssey House has always used a holistic approach to treatment and emphasizes the importance of community. This is crucial, according to Odyssey House director Peter Prevett, because addiction is such an all-encompassing disorder, cutting into every aspect of life, from family to mood to work. The drug for the addict becomes everything, Prevett says. Take it away and there is an empty vessel at the core of the body and mind. What better way to start filling the vessel than exercise? Prevett suggests. I strongly believe that exercise can serve as an antidote and as a type of inoculation against addiction, he says. As an antidote, you're giving the individual an avenue of life experience that most have not had. The goals of exercise, the feeling of exercise, the challenge of exercise, the pleasure and the pain, the accomplishment, the physical well-being, the self-esteem. All that exercise gives us, you're now presenting to the addict as a very compelling option. Inoculation ranks as equally important, given that most addicts fight a protracted, sometimes lifelong battle with relapse. And Prevett sees exercise as the best form of inoculation. Exercise is directly antithetical to drug-addictive behavior, because you need lung strength, muscle strength, mental acuity to engage in physical exercise, lots of things that drugs deprive you of. If you're not eating, not caring about your body, letting it waste away, having your mind distorted by being constantly intoxicated, you can't be a serious exerciser. You can't do it. Neurobiology is just catching up with what 20 years of experience have taught Prevett. The way he describes exercise's effect on the addict mirrors what I discussed in Chapter 5, about depression. As a treatment, exercise works from the top down in the brain, forcing addicts to adapt to a new stimulus and thereby allowing them to learn and appreciate alternative and healthy scenarios. It's activity-dependent training, and while it may not provide the immediate rush of a snort of cocaine, it instills a more diffuse sense of well-being that, over time, will become a craving in its own right. The inoculation works from the bottom up, physically blunting the urge to act by engaging the more primitive elements of the brain. Exercise builds synaptic detours around the well-worn connections automatically looking for the next fix. Not everyone is going to become a marathon runner, but more and more we're going from addict to athlete, says Prevett. Is it for everybody? Probably not. Is it for most people? Probably yes. Unjust rewards. As with so many discoveries about how the brain works, scientists stumbled on the first clues about addiction by accident. In 1954, psychologist James Olds and a graduate student named Peter Milner at McGill University in Montreal were studying behavior by inserting electrodes into the brains of live rats. They wanted to pinpoint an area related to learning, but in one of the animals, the electrode ended up in the wrong spot. The result was even more interesting than what they were looking for. The rat kept returning to the corner of its cage where it received its first jolt. To the researchers' amazement, they found they could steer the rodent like a remote-control toy by doling out bursts of electricity. The next day, the rat sought out the same corner. Clearly, the rat wanted the stimulation, so much so that it would ignore food placed in one corner in order to receive the shock in another. In the most famous of their experiments, Olds and Milner rigged up a lever so the rat could administer its own brain stimulation. After discovering that pressing the lever delivered a jolt, it pressed it about once every 5 seconds until the juice was switched off. Then the rat pawed at the lever a few times with no result, and promptly fell asleep. The brain area that Olds and Milner hit with that electrode is closely related to the nucleus accumbens, or reward center, and it has been the focus of addiction research ever since. It's a critical node of the attention system, as I described in the last chapter, and it's also important in addiction. The reward center provides the necessary motivation for the brain to learn behavior that brings us things we like or want or need. All the things people become addicted to, alcohol, caffeine, nicotine, drugs, sex, carbohydrates, gambling, playing video games, shopping, living on the edge, boost the dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. Regardless of the varying psychological effects different drugs have on the mind, they all boost dopamine in the reward center. As an illustration of the power of drugs, consider that while sex increases dopamine levels 50 to 100%, cocaine sends dopamine skyrocketing 300 to 800% beyond normal levels. The nucleus accumbens used to be known as the pleasure center, fueling the notion that addicts are essentially looking for a good time. And while pleasure is certainly an initial factor in enticing people to try a drug or their luck at a gaming table, it's not quite right to think of addicts purely as hedonists. Nobody enjoys being addicted. Indeed, by studying how dopamine works as the key messenger in the reward system, scientists have drawn a distinction between liking something and wanting it. Liking refers to the actual experience of pleasure versus the motivational state, which is the willingness to work for rewards, says Terry Robinson, a behavioral neuroscientist at the University of Michigan. Dopamine is involved in this wanting, but it's not involved in liking. The reward center is where ADHD and addiction overlap, which explains why both problems undermine motivation, self-control, and memory. It is no coincidence that about half of those with ADHD also struggle with substance abuse of some kind. The implications have changed the way scientists describe addiction. The pivotal issues seem to be salience and motivation, rather than pleasure. In this context, salience means something that stands out against the landscape of life, predominating over all other stimuli. Cues for both pleasure and pain send dopamine coursing through the nucleus accumbens to attract our attention, so we can take action to survive. For the developing substance abuser, the overload of dopamine has tricked the brain into thinking that paying attention to the drug is a matter of life or death. Drugs are tapping into the very core systems that have evolved to mediate survival, says Robinson. They activate the system in ways it was never meant to be activated. The National Institute on Drug Abuse now defines addiction as a compulsion that persists in spite of negative health and social consequences. Plenty of people use and abuse drugs, but only relatively few become addicts. Why? While dopamine in the reward center creates the initial interest in a drug or behavior, and provides the motivation to get it, what makes addiction such a stubborn problem is the structural changes it causes in the brain. Scientists now consider addiction a chronic disease because it wires in a memory that triggers reflexive behavior. The same changes occur regardless of whether the addiction is to drugs or gambling or eating. Once the reward has the brain's attention, the prefrontal cortex instructs the hippocampus to remember the scenario and sensation in vivid detail. If it's greasy food that you can't resist, the brain links the aroma of Kentucky Fried Chicken to Colonel Sanders' beard and that red and white bucket. Those cues take on salience and get linked together into a web of associations. Each time you drive up to KFC, the synaptic connections linking everything together get stronger and pick up new cues. This is how habits are formed. Typically, when we learn something, the connections stabilize and the levels of dopamine tail off over time. With addiction, especially drug addiction, dopamine floods the system with each drug use, reinforcing the memory and pushing other stimuli further into the background. Animal studies show that drugs such as cocaine and amphetamine make the dendrites in the nucleus accumbens bloom, thus increasing their synaptic connections. The changes can remain months and maybe even years after the drugs are stopped, which is why it's so easy to relapse. One way to look at addiction is that the brain has learned something too well. These adaptations lead to a vicious cycle in which the basal ganglia goes on autopilot whenever you smell fried chicken. And the prefrontal cortex can't override your actions even though you may know better. One of the responsibilities of the prefrontal cortex is to assess risk versus reward and to decide whether to inhibit behavior that may cause harm. With addicts, it's not so much that they make bad choices, is that they fail to inhibit behavior that has become reflexive. We know from studies in animals and humans that cocaine, for one, damages nerve cells in the prefrontal cortex and even reduces gray matter. And in recent years, imaging studies have shown that the prefrontal cortex doesn't fully develop until we are well into our 20s, which could explain why most people who experiment with drugs and get hooked do so as teenagers or during early adulthood, when their inhibition hasn't fully developed. They end up with a hypersensitive system that wants drugs, and they make very bad decisions, says Robinson. It's the worst of both possible worlds. Getting back on your feet. There's nothing like appearing before a judge to hasten the development of a teenager's inhibition. A patient of mine named Rusty might have ended up a drug addict, but the prospect of 3 years in jail scared him into cleaning up his act, and the exercise routine he developed in the process is why he's still on the right track today. I began treating Rusty the summer after his sophomore year in high school, a few months after he was hospitalized for attempting suicide. Feeling lonely and outcast, he had washed down a stash of pills with a pint of peach schnapps. He had good test scores, along with bad grades and a history of tantrums, but no friends at all. It was clear to me that he suffered from an attention deficit combined with fairly severe symptoms of what I called social dyslexia, meaning he didn't know how to talk to people or be relaxed and flexible in conversation. Rusty's strategy to be cool and make friends was to dress in all black and sell marijuana that he grew himself. I put him on a long-acting stimulant, a drug he couldn't abuse, for ADHD, and he picked up his grades a little and did very well on the SATs the spring of his junior year. Still, whenever he felt bored or at a loss, he would take anything he could get his hands on, from cocaine to cough syrup. Home alone one afternoon his senior year, he had a panic attack from too much cocaine and called 911. An ambulance came right away, along with the police, who found drugs in his room. He was arrested for possession and intent to distribute and spent the night in jail. A court date was set for 4 months down the road, and his lawyer and I worked out a treatment plan. Each week, he had to take 2 drug tests and attend a meeting at Alcoholics Anonymous and one at Narcotics Anonymous. He knew he had to stay clean at least until his court appearance, but he started to crave cocaine. His lawyer told him he'd probably get the maximum sentence of 3 years in jail, and he desperately wanted help. Dealing with his cravings was our first order of business, and I told Rusty that exercise could have a huge impact. He didn't like running or sports, and aside from a stint playing soccer as a child, he was essentially physically inert. I had just returned from my first visit to Naperville, and perhaps because of the way he dressed, I thought of a goth girl named Rachel, who had really transformed herself by playing Dance Dance Revolution, DDR, the interactive video game in which the player controls the action on screen by dancing on a mat that's connected to the television. The footwork involved is exhausting even to watch, like the tire drill football players practice, except that the game gets faster and faster at each level. Rusty agreed to try it, and although he felt clumsy at first, he started to enjoy it. Almost immediately, he said, it blunted his cravings. With nothing much to do that summer except worry about whether he'd be going to jail, he used the game to fill his time and to medicate himself. Guarding against boredom is critical because idle time is dangerous for someone fighting a drug habit. Rusty got to the point where he was playing DDR several hours in the morning and at night, every day. I saw that his energy level and his optimism picked up. I wrote a letter to the judge, and Rusty was put on probation rather than given jail time, on the condition that he would continue drug testing, Narcotics Anonymous, and counseling at college. He took his DDR setup with him and continued doing it every day for a while. Then he joined an intramural soccer team and started going to the gym. Exercise was a conduit for shifting Rusty's focus to a more productive life. I see exercise as a way of offsetting the feeling of hopelessness and uselessness that a lot of drug users have, and that certainly was a factor with Rusty. The routine and the physical activity gets the brain engaged and the mind moving in a direction other than toward the drug, reprogramming the basal ganglia to wire in an alternative reflexive behavior. Many people retreat to the couch and give up, but being in motion fosters the feeling that you can accomplish something. A doctor named Jean-Jacques Wang, one of the country's foremost addiction researchers and chairman of the medical department at Brookhaven National Laboratory, talks about movement in philosophical terms. In the Chinese language, a subject is an animal and an object is a vegetable, he says. You cannot ask a vegetable to jump from here to there. If you don't move, you are not an animal anymore. You become a vegetable. Certainly this is a factor with the marathoners of Odyssey House. But even with a milder case such as Rusty's, doing DDR chased the bleakness out of his view of his future. And while most experiences will pale in comparison to the high of snorting cocaine, the possibility of a rich life can help keep that memory in perspective. Rusty is now in his sophomore year of college, making good grades, and dating a girl who is also committed to staying sober. He's taken a leadership role in his dorm, and he's gotten into rock climbing as well as playing soccer. He even started scuba diving, a family activity that he'd avoided in the past. After a recent diving vacation, he told me that he is constantly amazed to see how rich and colorful natural life can be. Craving a dopamine fix. What Rusty finally sees, that he can find pleasure without drugs, is vital to resisting the urge. When you talk to hardcore addicts, you often hear that they feel numb to most things. Naturally satisfying forms of stimulation, such as love, food, and social interaction, are a bland backdrop to the vivid experience of the drug. The normal course of life doesn't do it. They can't feel it. Some people are simply born this way. A groundbreaking study in 1990 revealed, for instance, that a lot of alcoholics have a gene variation, the D2R2 allele, that robs the reward center of dopamine receptors, lowering levels of the neurotransmitter. Presence of the D2R2 allele doesn't guarantee you'll end up as an addict, but it's more likely. While 25% of the general population has the variation, in one study, researchers found it in 70% of alcoholics who had cirrhosis, presumably the most addicted, since they continued drinking in the face of life-threatening liver damage. In a subsequent study of cocaine addicts, half had the D2R2 allele, and 80% of those who also abused other drugs had it. Results tell a similar story with gamblers and the morbidly obese. About half display the gene variation, but when we factor in other addictive behavior, it's more like 80%. Researchers named this problem reward deficiency syndrome, and the media declared that scientists had found the alcoholic gene. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. Without question, if the reward center isn't receiving enough input, you're genetically predisposed to be constantly craving, relentlessly searching for a way to compensate for the deficit. Reward deficiency also undermines the attention and stress systems. When dopamine is out of balance, the amygdala gets involved because it thinks survival is at risk, and that intensifies the pursuit of bringing the brain to equilibrium. This relates back to why so many people with ADHD are seen as stress junkies. Cortisol quickly boosts dopamine to improve attention. You can see how this nagging feeling, people describe it as a hollowness inside, could leave a person vulnerable to addictive behavior, from taking drugs to gorging on chocolate to playing video games 40 hours a week. But just because you have reward deficiency syndrome doesn't mean you're destined for Odyssey House. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of factors that influence addiction, and the drive to find something new and exciting can just as easily turn people into bold explorers, iconoclastic artists, or maverick entrepreneurs, or send them down any number of paths where pushing conventional boundaries and seeing the world differently are highly valued commodities. Not surprisingly, athletes in high-risk sports like skydiving display less inhibition and more thrill-seeking behavior than, say, rowers. A recent study from Holland also showed that, like hardcore addicts, many skydivers don't experience pleasure from typical daily life. Both skydivers and addicts have a higher-than-normal threshold for excitement. But is that the cause or the result of the dopamine-boosting behavior? Other research shows that drugs such as cocaine damage D2 receptors, the slots the neurotransmitter plugs into to signal salience. If you continually subject your brain to an overload of dopamine, the number of receptors will dwindle. So, regardless of what your brain looked like when you were born, the more drugs you take, the more drugs you'll need to feel the same rush. The same is true of people who overeat. You need more to make you feel good, says Brookhaven's Jean-Jacques Wang. Fight the urge, shake the habit. A study in London in 2004 showed that even 10 minutes of exercise could blunt an alcoholic's craving. The researchers divided 40 hospitalized patients who had just completed detox into two groups. One was assigned to stationary cycling at moderate intensity, the other light intensity. The next day, they switched the groups and found that intense exercise significantly reduced the urge for a drink. This is what happened with my patient Susan from Chapter 3, who used her jump rope to fend off the stress-induced urge to drink wine in the middle of the day. The biology of stress ties in with addiction in that withdrawal puts the body in survival mode. If you suddenly quit drinking, for instance, you're turning off the dopamine spigot, and the hypothalamic-pituitary-adrenal axis gets thrown out of balance. The intense unpleasantness of withdrawal lasts for only a few days, but your system remains sensitive for much longer. If you're in this delicate state and come under further stress, your brain interprets the situation as an emergency and sends you looking for more alcohol. That's how a problem at work or a fight with a lover can cause a relapse. For someone who's been dependent on drugs and has altered his dopamine system, the most effective solution to a stressful situation, and the only one he knows, is the drug. But exercise is another solution. In smokers, just 5 minutes of intense exercise can be beneficial. Nicotine is an oddball among addictive substances, as it works as a stimulant and a relaxant at the same time. Exercise fights the urge to smoke because, in addition to smoothly increasing dopamine, it also lowers anxiety, tension, and stress levels, the physical irritability that makes people so grouchy when they're trying to quit. Exercise can fend off cravings for 50 minutes and double or triple the interval to the next cigarette. And the fact that exercise sharpens thinking comes into play here, because one of the withdrawal symptoms of nicotine is impaired focus. As evidence of this, one study found that there are more workplace accidents during the Great American Smokeout than on any other day of the year. Many of my ADHD patients use cigarettes to help them focus when they have to write or push through a challenging task, and without the nicotine, they feel lost. Some drugs, of course, dull the brain to begin with. A novel study from researchers in Iran recently examined how exercise affects rats on morphine. Their hypothesis was that since exercise influences dopamine and plasticity in the same brain areas involved with addiction and learning, maybe it would counteract the memory loss that goes along with being high. The scientists conditioned the rats by putting them in a dark box in which the floor shocked their feet, and then they did follow-up tests to measure how long it took the rats to move to another box that was harmless but well lit. Rodents prefer darkness. The rats were divided into 4 groups. One group ran on a treadmill and received a shot of morphine before each trial. One ran and received a placebo injection of saline. Another received morphine but didn't exercise. and a control group received neither exercise nor an injection. Both groups that exercised remembered that the dark box was bad news. They hesitated the longest to enter it and were the quickest to leave when they were shocked. Amazingly, the exercise and morphine group performed better than the control group, indicating that exercise offsets the mind-dulling effects of the drug. In the same study, the researchers found that exercise dramatically reduced withdrawal symptoms in the exercise and morphine group when they cut off the drugs. In rats, the signs of withdrawal are identified as wet dog shakes, writhing, and diarrhea. This fact alone should be enough to convince a recovering addict to lace up his sneakers, and it lends scientific credence to the treatment approach at Odyssey House. A Tale of Dependence. Over the years, I've seen many people with reward deficiency syndrome. The most dramatic example is a Dutch woman I'll call Zoe, who suffers from severe ADHD and has a tumultuous history of depression, aggression, and a range of substance abuse. Most notably, she was a chronic marijuana smoker for 20 years who believed that self-medicating was the only way she could feel calm and focused. In reality, she was trying to blot out the frustration and anger of her life. As a child, Zoe told me, she was combative and had severe learning problems. Now 40, she is still prone to tantrums and anxiety. On one occasion, when she was flying to Boston for a visit, she erupted in a panic attack and forced the plane to return to Amsterdam. Zoe spent 13 years getting through college, which is a long time, even for her field of veterinary medicine, partly because she wasn't diagnosed with ADHD until she was 27. She received a prescription for Ritalin, but first had to go to a detox clinic to give up marijuana. "I was smoking 10 or 20 joints a day," she recalls. "When I was in there, I was like a wild animal in a cage." She stopped smoking marijuana for about a year, but then she relapsed and soon fell back into her heavy habit of staying high throughout the day, while also taking the Ritalin and antidepressants. Although she found a high-level job in her profession, Zoe stalled out in the decade after college and in many ways gave up on developing herself. Because she was always so driven to find an immediate reward, she didn't set goals and strategies to move forward in life. Zoe often complained that she felt like life wasn't worth it. Smoking marijuana, she says, kept her from dwelling on the fact that she was unhappy and discontent. She had always exercised sporadically, cycling, sailing, and horseback riding, but I raised the subject of doing something on a regular basis. I appealed to her knowledge of medicine and explained how exercise could change her brain chemistry and rewire connections in the pathways controlling her mood, aggression, and attention, as well as her addiction. After reading several of the studies I've included in this audio program, she committed to giving daily exercise a try, and she quit smoking marijuana again. "There was no alternative," she says. "I had to do something." What she did was get an indoor bike trainer of the type used by serious cyclists to hone their balance and stamina. You pedal on free-spinning drums, acutely aware of the possibility that you could slip off and careen across the room. I'm not sure how Zoe settled on this extremely challenging form of exercise, but it has worked out tremendously well. The balance and precision required to ride on the rollers engages the entire attention system, from the motor centers of the cerebellum and basal ganglia to the reward center and prefrontal cortex. "At first I hated to do it because it doesn't bring you anywhere," she says. "Now I'm very handy on it, and it's beneficial because it makes me concentrate as well as exercise. It's exciting because you don't want to fall down." As if kicking her habit wasn't difficult enough, Zoe's husband left her in the midst of her effort to stay sober, just before Christmas. I was worried, and so was she. "During the winter it gets cold and very dark in Holland," she wrote in an email. "I was so scared that I would get depressed again and go back on pot, but I haven't. The change comes from the difference between feeling like a loser, smoking, and a winner, exercise." Zoe's recovery is tenuous, as it is for any long-term drug user, but she's certainly on the right track. She sends me regular updates about trying to break her record distance on the bike trainer, and she's also taken up the jump rope. Here's a snippet from one of her typically buoyant messages. I just did 10 minutes of rope jumping, heart rate 140, exhausting, but I had to do it. This is so good, because in 10 minutes it feels like a half hour biking. Maybe I'll continue this. It's a fast reward. It's the exercise I'm craving nowadays. A natural high. Some would debate whether Zoe was addicted to marijuana, but there's no question she was dependent on it. She had all the signs of chemical dependency, including the physical and emotional irritability of withdrawal. Studies in rats show that if they get used to a chronic dose of tetrahydrocannabinol, THC, the active compound in marijuana, and then are deprived of it, the brain floods the system with corticotropin-releasing factor, which activates the amygdala and thus the entire stress system. The rodents experience shaking, tremors, and twitchy movements that peak about 48 hours after the last dose. Indeed, Zoe felt like a rat in a cage when she went through detox. Along with the physical symptoms, the shutdown of the dopamine system brought on intense feelings of depression and anxiety. The way exercise blunts the symptoms of withdrawal is by calming the amygdala and boosting dopamine. Regardless of whether there is such a thing as marijuana addiction, studying THC's effect on the brain has provided new clues about how exercise counteracts addiction of any stripe. To begin with, the feeling that often comes after exercise can serve as a harmless replacement for the drug high. In a recent study in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, researcher Arne Dietrich wrote that the way people describe runner's high is similar to the claims of distorted perception, atypical thought patterns, diminished awareness of one's surroundings, and intensified introspective understanding of one's sense of identity and emotional status made by people who describe drug or trance states. We've been on the case of the runner's high for 3 decades, and in the last few years the focus has expanded beyond endorphins to include endocannabinoids, a class of neurotransmitters. Endocannabinoids are to THC as endorphins are to morphine, substances produced in the body that elicit the same effect as a drug. Likewise, they both dull pain. Scientists discovered the endocannabinoids in the early 1990s after realizing that THC binds to specialized receptors in the brain. These receptors didn't evolve for us to enjoy marijuana, obviously, so there had to be some natural substance the body produces for them. What they found were the neurotransmitters enatamide and 2-arachidonyl glycerol, 2-AG. It turns out that marijuana, exercise, and chocolate all activate these same receptors in the brain. Both of these endocannabinoids are produced in the body and the brain when we exercise. They travel through the bloodstream to activate receptors in the spinal cord, and this blocks pain signals from getting to the brain, not unlike morphine. They also move throughout the reward system and the prefrontal cortex, where they have a direct effect on dopamine. When the endocannabinoid receptors are strongly activated, they produce all the euphoric feelings of marijuana, and, along with endorphins, they act as the body's extra-strength aspirin. Doctors are starting to use enatamide to treat pain syndromes such as chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia, and a number of studies have shown that gradually increasing exercise can relieve the pain and fatigue associated with these syndromes. The link between exercise and these natural painkillers makes perfect sense. They evolved to help us deal with the inevitable pain of straining muscles and joints during the hunt. Unlike endorphins, endocannabinoids pass easily across the blood-brain barrier, which, for some researchers, makes them a more plausible explanation for runner's high. In 2003, a group led by psychologist Philip Sparling of Georgia Tech University showed for the first time that exercise activates the endocannabinoid system. Using fit, male college students, either running on treadmills or cycling on stationary bikes for 50 minutes at 70 to 80% of their maximum heart rate, the researchers measured how the effort affected blood levels of enatamide. The result? Enatamide nearly doubled. Runner's high itself is difficult to study because it's so unpredictable. Even marathon runners don't experience the feeling every time they train. And why isn't there such a thing as swimmer's high? One intriguing theory is based on the relatively new finding that there are endocannabinoid receptors in the skin that may be activated only by all the pounding and jostling of running. Regardless of whether the particular gauzy delirium of runner's high kicks in, Sparling's work clearly implies that the boost in anandamide is at least one reason we feel relaxed and satisfied after moderately intense exercise. Scientists still debate whether endorphins are involved, however, and it seems likely that the overall effect is some combination of these factors. Hooked on the good stuff. If exercise acts like certain drugs in the brain, then you might wonder whether it can also be addicting. I get this question all the time, and the short answer is yes, but don't worry about it. Scientists have tested exercise addiction in rats and found that if they have unrestricted access to a running wheel and are given food only 1 hour a day, the rats will log about 6 miles a day and eventually run themselves to death. They don't learn that they need to get all of their nutrition during their 1 hour feeding. The more they run, the less they eat, and their calorie intake falls short of the output. They are addicted, just as they would be to cocaine. Curiously, the experiment doesn't work if a treadmill is substituted for the running wheel. Perhaps there's something about the infinite nature of chasing the next rung that keeps the rats hooked. Whatever the case, the running wheel is a perfect metaphor for addiction. The danger of getting addicted to exercise applies to a very small segment of the population, most notably girls with anorexia or anyone with a body dysmorphic syndrome, a mental disorder defined by a preoccupation with a perceived deficit in appearance. They eat less and less, and when they exercise they become lightheaded and exhilarated, the high only reinforcing the cycle. They feel great for a short while, and they think they are on their way to looking great. Sadly, their approach will never get them there. But for the vast majority of people, this trap is a remote danger. Even if exercise becomes a dependence, as it could for Zoe, for example, there's little to worry about. I can think of no better example of somebody with an exercise dependence than ultramarathoner Dean Karnazes, the 44-year-old Californian who has appeared on 60 Minutes, The Tonight Show, and countless magazine covers for his mind-bending feat of running 50 marathons in 50 days in 50 different states. He also ran 350 miles without stopping. Only slightly less impressive to me is that over the past 15 years, the longest period he has gone without exercising is 3 days. "I had the flu," Karnazes recalls. "I was still sick, but I finally said, screw it, I need to bust out a run." For starters, his streak says something about the formidable strength of his immune system. Karnazes was drunk at a bar on his 30th birthday when he decided to make a change in his life, at that very moment. He stumbled home, grabbed an old pair of sneakers, and ran 30 miles into the night. He was no alcoholic and has never been into drugs, but the question remains, does this guy have a problem? "Maybe 10 to 20% of the time I do think of running as an addiction," he says. "What I really long for is the feeling of bliss or satiety that I get after exercise. It makes me feel complete. I'm most tuned into this when I can't exercise. If I'm traveling or I'm in meetings all day, I can feel it pulling at me. I'll think, why am I ready to implode? I'm crawling out of my skin here. And then I realize my body needs to move. It's almost a feeling of being trapped." There is no typical week for Karnazes, but he says he averages 70 to 90 miles, 3 to 4 hours on most days. In other words, he moves more in a day than most Americans do in a week. This frightens people. It would be easy to paint Karnazes as a freak of nature, and plenty of people have. When you talk to him, however, it seems that despite the huge time demand of training, he leads a balanced life. He held 9-to-5 jobs at Fortune 500 companies for more than a decade, and then became president of a natural snack food company before recently transitioning into a professional athlete and author. His book, Ultramarathon Man, is a bestseller. He has 2 children, ages 11 and 9, whom he tucks in most every night and drives to and from school every day. He typically wakes up at around 3 a.m. after 4 or 5 hours of sleep to get in his training before the kids need to go to school. I have built my lifestyle around running so I can support this level of activity, Karnazes says. Perhaps it's an addiction. I don't know. I've never been through psychoanalysis. I'm just listening to my hard wiring. Luckily, I'm not shooting something in my veins or hopping down to the bar every night after work. Exercise is the ultimate drug, right? What drug always works and doesn't have any unhealthy side effects? Filling the vessel. My patients Rusty and Zoe are inspiring examples of people who have replaced addiction with exercise, instituting routines in their lives that serve as a healthy alternative to the full-time pursuit of drugs. As I explained, the addict's brain adapts at every level to focus attention and effort around getting the reward. The brain functions the same way whether the addiction is to alcohol, drugs, food, gambling, or any other addictive substance or behavior. As addiction progresses, there is less and less room for anything else in life. When an addict quits, what's left is emptiness. In this respect, dealing with addiction is similar to battling feelings of anxiety and depression. Getting rid of the problem is only the first step. Once the addiction or the negative emotions are gone, the void needs to be filled with some positive behavior for the change to take root. There can hardly be a better option than physical exercise. After all, this is what we're supposed to be doing, moving in the world. The fact that exercise counteracts anxiety and depression directly can have a huge impact on any form of addiction,